Hi guys, welcome to this next video in my learning how to write a history paper tutorial. In our last video, we talked about um, starting your paper, deciphering the prompt, writing your thesis statement, brainstorming and outlining kind of the setup process. Today, we're going to talk about what you should be doing in each paragraph to articulate your ideas more clearly. So I'm going to switch over to screen sharing so you all can see the PowerPoint, and we'll go through this just like we did the last video. All right, so the basic outline for today is first we are going to talk about what I call the evidence sandwich model. How do you write an effective, well-organized body paragraph for history papers? Then we'll, in the same breath, talk about citation. Footnotes are the biggest hang-up for a lot of students. So what are some good ways to work with what you have and make sure you're using the correct format on your citations? The evidence sandwich model is effectively a way of thinking about your paragraph structure that uses a very easy to remember analogy. You will have these elements, your topic sentence, which is a mini thesis statement. That's your first sentence. It defines what you're about to talk about. This is like the first piece of bread. This is the foundation on which your entire thing will be built. Your evidence is the cheese. You kind of need it, but it's not the meat of your paragraph, which is your explanation. And then the so what wraps it all together. And we'll go through each of these elements in a minute. So we're going to start with a thesis statement. If you watched the last video, you know that we're starting with a basic prompt about Japanese internment camps. And this is our sample thesis statement. The internment of Japanese Americans was an inhumane measure based on racist war hysteria rather than on military necessity. So, as I promised, each part of this example is going to go back to that essay prompt. So for your topic sentence, you need to pick a part of your thesis statement and turn it into a small argument that you can prove with your evidence. For example, although the Japanese community, American community, posed no real threat to the US, the official justification for the internment cited military necessity. If you go back to our thesis statement, you can see military necessity is a component. So there you go. We're going to talk about military necessity in this paragraph. Your evidence needs to support that topic sentence. You have to choose from your provided materials something that demonstrates that what you're saying is accurate. In terms of whether or not you use outside sources, that is entirely dependent upon your professors. I usually recommend only going with the classroom materials unless they explicitly say in the prompt that you're allowed to find your own. Stick with the provided ones unless you're told otherwise. This section, the evidence section, should be the only thing that you cite in your paragraph, right? For example, when President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 in 1942, he explicitly authorized the Secretary of War and other military commanders to create military zones on the West Coast and decide which people should be excluded. And there's my little footnote for citation, right? So you can see this directly answers my topic sentence. This is directly connected. And we'll talk about how it's connected in the next section, your explanation. This is where you make your argument. Your evidence is not your argument, your explanation is. Tell us what we learn about your argument from that evidence that you just provided. For example, while this order does not directly reference the Japanese, it allowed military commanders to justify the mass removal of Japanese Americans from their homes and businesses as an uncomfortable but necessary wartime measure after the Japanese assault on Pearl Harbor. There you go. Now you have told us why that evidence is important to your paper. How does it support it? You've just told us. Your so what is your mini conclusion. It's a little statement that connects it back up to your big thesis statement and then allows you to settle and move on to the next point. By issuing an order that permitted the military to make this decision, Roosevelt created the impression that interning Japanese Americans was a precautionary measure to prevent further attacks. Wrapped up the idea. And now we'll look at it all together. And I've kind of color-coded it so that you have no problem seeing the sections. And I'll read it through with you. Although the Japanese American community posed no real threat to the US, official justification for the internment cited military necessity. When President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 in 1942, he explicitly authorized the Secretary of War and other military commanders to create military zones on the West Coast and decide which people should be excluded. While this order does not directly reference the Japanese, it allowed military commanders to justify the mass removal of Japanese Americans from their homes and businesses as an uncomfortable but necessary wartime measure after the Japanese assault on Pearl Harbor. By issuing an order that vested internment authority in the military, Roosevelt created the impression that interning Japanese Americans was a precautionary measure to prevent further attacks on US soil. There we go. See how all of those pieces flow together and you get a nice coherent argument. And it's only in 127 words for those of you whose professors are really strict about word count. It's pretty short, but it contains everything that you need. There is another way to do this, to structure the same paragraph. A lot of students come to me and say, oh, but I have so much evidence. And the professor requires us to use so many things. How do I use more than one piece of evidence in a paragraph? We'll talk about that. And we'll talk about it with what could hypothetically be the second paragraph in this sample paper. For paragraph 2, you need to include a transition from the previous paragraph. All of your ideas should flow together, and this can be done pretty simply, right? Despite this official explanation referencing the past paragraph, racism and war hysteria were at the core of the decision to intern Japanese Americans. Pardon my typo. In an interview, Aiko Herzog Yoshinanga, who was a high school senior at the time of Pearl Harbor, recalls increased scrutiny of the Japanese community, including persistent rumors that the FBI would arrest anyone with Japanese books as a potential spy. Her recollections tally with historians' general consensus that the insistence on viewing Japanese Americans as a threat was disproportionate in comparison with the lack of scrutiny experienced by the German and Italian American communities. You see, I have my footnotes in both places. Then your explanation, the fact that Japanese Americans were targeted en masse while other so-called enemy aliens were not, underscores the racism inherent in the internment camps. Even though the Japanese Imperial Army had attacked US soil, Japanese Americans on the West Coast were not automatically disloyal, and many were American citizens. As such, the internment process is rooted in fears of Japanese invasion and the racist certainty that all Japanese were alike. And you can see, again, how these chunks work together. And again, it's only 162 words. If you only have 1,000 or 1,500 words to write, you can get a fair amount in 1,000 and 1,500 words if you are following a pretty organized structure. You can see if you compare the two sample paragraphs I've given you, this one, the evidence section, that green bit, is a little bit longer, but so is your explanation. Effectively, you need to make sure that your evidence is lumped together and then your explanation can address all of it at once. That's why I usually recommend you stick to 1 to 2 pieces of evidence per paragraph, because that makes it easier for you to have a coherent explanation that addresses everyone's concerns. Now, we've been talking a lot about evidence. I've shown you the little footnotes that I put in. Let's talk a little bit about what evidence use and citation, good evidence use and citation should look like. When your space is limited, you want to paraphrase rather than quote, unless the language of a quote is essential. You need to cite these paraphrases, right? These things that you've kind of taken the idea and rephrased it, because the ideas belong to somebody else. You didn't come up with that. You got the idea from somebody else. So you need to acknowledge that. The citation rule is the same. It's just how you are using the information, how you are phrasing the information is different. That is why I always emphasize that you will always, 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 always cite the evidence section of your paper. It's a lot easier to avoid plagiarism when you know that that second sentence of your paragraph is gonna need a citation. When you do decide to quote, never use more than a single line on your page. Take only the portions that you need and move on with your argument. If you use block quotes, you're wasting space. I've written, as you might imagine, a ton of papers, and I think I used block quotes twice in my life, and both of those were in a 75-page thesis that I wrote to graduate. And I used 2 block quotes in a 3 to 4 page paper, which is what most of you will be asked to write. you are absolutely not going to need to use a block quote. You will be purely wasting space. And again, as I said a minute ago, use your classroom sources unless the prompt indicates otherwise. If you're not sure how your professor feels about outside sources and you think you found something really, really cool and relevant, ask. Always ask for clarification. It's way better to do that. And 9 times out of 10, your professor or your TA would much rather answer a question about, is this source okay? Do you want me to only use the class sources? They'd rather answer that question than have to deduct points and get snarky with you in the footnotes because you didn't do what they thought they'd instructed you to do. Ask, 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 ask for clarification. When it comes to Chicago style, most professors in a history paper will ask you to use it. If a professor does not want you to use it, they will usually say what they want you to do instead. Some professors, because they know you're only writing about 1 or 2 sources, they just want you to use the page number. They'll tell you that. If they don't tell you what they'd like instead, use Chicago. Again, have 1 citation for every evidence section. If it is in that evidence section, you must cite it with a footnote. Attributive tags don't count. For example, some of you may have been taught in an English class that if you say in the first part of the paragraph, according to John Smith in this article, and then you paraphrase him, then you don't need a citation. In history, you do. Regardless of what you say in the text, history will require a footnote for every citation that you use. But the rules for where you place the citation are the same as MLA or APA. You put it at the end of your sentence. Basically, you just need to remember that essays are like lab reports. Humanities, we don't do labs, but we do write essays. So we need to be able, just like in the sciences, we need to be able to verify and duplicate your results. We need to know how you got what you got. And we need to be able to go and identify the exact same sources and see if what you've concluded is valid. That is why historians are really intense about their citations. It's why your professors are likely to be very strict about them. It's actually quite essential to the discipline. It seems annoying, but you do have to be as precise about it as you can. A lot of students ask me, how do I do this? If you are using Microsoft Word on a PC, go to references in your toolbar up on the top, insert footnote. Excuse me, my God. It will then automatically format it for you. Don't try to tinker with it. Just insert footnote, type what you need, and move on. Some basic formats for you are here. You can pause the video and copy them down if you want. I'm not going to read through them. But these are basically the things that you will need to know. You only need the full citation the first time that you cite the source. After that, you can just use last name, title, page number. You will always need, at this level, you will always need the page number. So it helps if as you're reading, you take notes that include the page number. It streamlines the process a little bit. And that is effectively all you need to know to write a paragraph. I wanted to keep it short and brief, but feel free to go back, pause. I'm going to include a link to my first video kind of at the end. Go ahead and check out the other things in the series and let me know what you think. Hopefully this is helpful for you.